Well, welcome everyone who is here. This is data visualization and accessibility today. It's October 15th. That date on there is mostly for me as the dates swim together. Good for me to know. It's already the middle of October. Great. So first things first, my kind of usual welcome. You all heard me say it before I hit record, but this is going to be recorded and posted publicly on YouTube. So just be aware of that. It will mostly be me talking, but if you do unmute or anything, it will catch that. We will be following the Quansight Code of Conduct for this event because it's a scientific Python event, but it's organized and is moderated by Quansight employees. We didn't want to have conflicting code of conduct, so just so you are aware. And moderators, Tanya and Gabriel are here today. If you need anything, they'll be keeping an eye on chat, letting me know if I miss anything somewhere along the way too. So that's the formalities. And introducing myself, as I often forget, my name is Isabela, she, her pronouns, and I'm a designer of many things, at least that's what they call me. I work at Quansight Labs, and I've worked on a lot of different projects in the scientific Python ecosystem, not the project specifically. You'll hear me reference some of them talking about data visualizations today. And these events are a part of the scientific Python project, contrary to the ecosystem comment I just made. So thank you to them for that, and welcome. What are we going to do today? I already linked notes in the chat. If someone messages me that they need the link again, though, I'm happy to pull that up. We are going to explore data visualizations as arguments, right? They're making some kind of claim that we're going to be looking into. So I'm going to cover kind of the parts of an argument because those are the parts I want to make sure you have with data visualizations, and then peel back kind of layers of data visualizations to discuss how to make sure that like information, that argument is preserved in different situations where those layers may or may not be available to someone, which is essentially what accessibility is concerned with, making sure access is consistent. And I'm going to write some takeaways and more resources because I always try to. This is not the be all end all of this topic. And upcoming events, as I always have to finish off on. Within this, to kind of summarize what we will cover, overlap between data visualizations and accessibility. The title is not misleading you, I hope. We'll look at data visualizations kind of from the lens of different constraints that you may have as someone designing for it, right? Like how people may or may not be able to interact with what you predict. Ideas for how this could impact data visualizations you make, and I will ask some questions throughout too to make sure that you get a chance to tell me concerns you have based on what I said. And more information, you'll notice on here, I will not be discussing, specific code fixes because of the variety of ways that people generate visualizations. I can't really give specific recommendations in almost any case without interacting with the visualization or knowing how it was made. So that will not be what I am doing, but in many cases I will be telling you the expected result. So you'll have the practical outcome you're looking for that you can apply to whatever method you're doing. Great. Actually, I'm going to pause really quick and check for questions before I get into more talking. There will be a lot of me talking today. Okay. I try and bop quietly for a moment. Nothing is popping up, so take a sip of my tea and continue. Great. So why is this about data visualizations? I don't know if anybody was really asking this. People are often very excited when I bring up data visualizations, but it matters to me to kind of think about, like, why are we having this conversation, right? How do I make my data visualizations more accessible is probably the most asked question directed at me in this ecosystem. Whenever I, show up in a place and talk about accessibility, do a talk somewhere at a conference, that's almost invariably the next question that I get. So it's in demand. And team involved with recent accessibility work in the scientific Python project specifically requested it, I think because of that, and just because of the proliferation of visualizations in our ecosystem, but I would also say in general on the internet, but also beyond. And it's a multi-layered enough topic to be discussing for a little bit longer. And I'm trying to think if there's anything I didn't put on there, but that sounds about right. I guess I did cover my bases with the slides. Sometimes I second guess myself. However, all of this, I think it's important to say, I'm not really a maker of data visualizations, at least not in the way that there are people that do this, you know, day to day in their job. Hopefully some of you in the audience are those people, but that is not what I'm doing. I really, my formal teaching on visualizations is from the visual side with that design background. I do have knowledge beyond that experientially, but I think it's worth noting, right, that this is not singularly my area of expertise. And data visualizations that people create often vary beyond my wildest dreams is the dramatic way to say it, but it's true, right? I've seen so many things in this ecosystem. You will come up with things that I have not seen before, and we will have to find ways to do. So that's part of why I won't be able to give you exact, you know, press this button, write this code every time to do this, because there will be things I'm not imagining. So on that note of things that I don't know, I'd like to point you, there is like existing work, there are existing recommendations on how to handle things like data visualizations. Now I'm going to summarize these because not all of them are actually claiming they're specifically about data visualizations, but they're all ones that have informed me or provide examples that people might want to have. So Chartability is a project explicitly for data visualizations. They, I think, call them data experiences, but making sure that those, like, it's a framework for reviewing, basically combines really big deal accessibility web framework with data visualizations to help people find a way to connect those two. This is the most topical and also the most thorough that I'm available on this topic. Semiotic, which is a library for generating plots, actually has a good accessibility page, and the reason I bring it up a lot is they have a lot of different types of plots, and all of them have examples so that you can dig into what they're doing, what is the impact, like you can try things out for yourself on there if you want to see what's happening. The Diagram Center's image description guidelines, if you've seen me in an alt text workshop that I've done, you've seen me bring this up. Image description guidelines, I'm linking to all of them because they have separate sections, but they have for a lot of different plot types, ways that they recommend describing it if you are working in a text-only setting, also mentioning how to put the data elsewhere, so that can be useful. W3CY, so that's World Wide Web Consortium, Web Accessibility Initiative. They have an alt decision tree, which is probably one of my favorite links to hand people on this topic because it kind of breaks down what information is gathered and what you need to do to preserve it. MathWorks has some information if that is relevant to anyone working with MathWorks on accessibility. And Notebooks for All, which for full transparency was a project that I worked on. Jupyter Notebook testing, which included data visualizations in Jupyter Notebooks with user feedback. So I've listed a bunch of things at you, but I think it's really important because I don't want this to happen. This is an XKCD that I really like. So how standards proliferate, right? There are 14 competing standards. People gather and say, that's ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Yeah, woohoo. And then there are 5 or 15. I brought the number down. That is the opposite. Now we have another competing standard. I don't want to do this today. There's a lot of work people have done with this, and I'm really hoping to build on it and collect it, synthesize it even for you all. But keep in mind, there are deeper dives out there that I think are really helpful depending on what you need. So with that in mind, right, I do want to build on and reference these existing, I said standards here. Most of them are not standards in the very formal sense, but definitely recommendations that are longer than this. But I want to think flexible enough to support all those different visualizations, but be specific enough to make actions clear. So don't hesitate to ask me if you're saying, wait, you're talking about this too abstractly, or what do you think I should do in this case? Please do ask. I think that would be one of the most helpful uses of our time together. And I want to be approachable for people without an accessibility background. There's a lot of this information, in fact, is really good for people with an accessibility background, but if you haven't dug into that, there's going to be a lot of unfamiliar terms, expectations, and assumptions. So kind of going from the reverse side. Right. I'm going to take a drink of tea again. Gotta slow myself down or I will keep picking up speed like a train without brakes, you know? Anyway, so what do I know about data visualization? I asked myself a lot when writing this. You know, I'm not the expert that I would have chosen for this. So what do I know? One, there's data. Seems obvious, but pretty important. It's not a data visualization if we don't actually have some data to dig into. Could be something different entirely, right? You're seeing this data from a certain angle, like however you're deciding to lay it out, whether that's like the method of chart or the way that the sample has been curated, the way that you cleaned the data. There is kind of an angle being seen here. And what I think and what helped me really navigate through this was there is an argument, right? Something is being said by having this visualization. It's not some neutral statement of data. I know the way some people argue. So if I'm going to talk about arguments, I need to make sure that we have some kind of common knowledge on the parts of an argument. This will be kind of the through line for which I will be looking at visualizations with you when we get there. So arguments have a claim. This is, I think, colloquially, the part that people will often say is the argument, right? This is well, this is what I want you to believe, or this is what I think, right? The premise is kind of the reason, right? It's the immediate assumption behind it. Evidence is the I believe this because. Everything after the because is going to be your supporting evidence. This is not often mentioned, but I also think it's really important to an argument to know who is the author, a term loosely used, right? That could be a group of people, that could be a single person, it could be an organization, right? When was it argued? Timing, right? A visualization from, 100 years ago might be making claims that we have since found other information for, or, a visualization from last week could say something very different than a visualization this week. The where and how was it argued? This could be both the medium, right? So like we are in a virtual meeting right now, but I could be saying this to someone on a podium in person, right? This could be printed in a book. Those often inform the method as well. So those are parts of an argument. I'm actually going to pause a moment and see if there's any questions, anything popping up, but I don't see anything. Cool. Great. I love arguments, but I am quite a bookworm. So you need all of your visualization, which I will get into this in a moment, in order to understand its argument, right? These go back to back, and so we need all of it in order for this to be coherent and for this to be coherent to people with disabilities, right? To preserve the access to this information is our goal. So parts of the data visualization, as I've mapped them out because I have seen others, I want to make sure that all your data visualizations have some sort of title, a source, data, right? Structure, this could be anything from choosing the entire plot to the parts of a plot that make it that, right? So it could be I'm, choosing a box plot, but it also could be there are, axes needed for this. There's an area in order. There's, scale differences. There's labels so that it's not just meaningless axes, for example. I'm also including any annotations under labels though, because those are optional. There's a key in many cases. Sometimes they're built in, sometimes they're separate, but you need to understand the visual encoding that's happening. And there is some kind of significance, right? There's some reason that you decided to make a visualization, whether that's, I want you to look at this trend line. There's this pattern. There's an outlier. There's no change. There's a lot of change. That significance becomes really important to maintain, right? Because there's a reason that this was here. It's not just some blanket thing. Okay, I am seeing a raised hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, what's the difference in your mind between source and data? Just because it's not clear to me.
Oh, yes. No, that's a good point. It was that the source of the data should be called out. I often see visualizations that have the data, but you don't necessarily know where it's being pulled from. So I'm listing source kind of right after title in the sense that it's like citing your source somewhere, or that I should be able to access it, right? Not all data is going to be open where I can just immediately go to the source, but that's kind of the idea. Did that clarify?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Gotcha. Like if it isn't like data that I literally took in my own like lab notebook, then yeah,
And even if it
cite it.
is, to be honest, I would like that to be noted somewhere so that
Right,
so
right,
that
right.
someone knows that that's where it came from, which I don't want to no, actually. I have a thing that will point out the parts on a chart. I have another thing before that, but yeah, I will hopefully that will clarify too. Thank you for asking. That's a good point. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for asking. So kind of the thing that I want to get at here is, if accessibility is not the framework that someone is used to approaching it, I would actually tell someone to start with the argument. If you make sure all of the argument is available under different circumstances, that is a great step towards accessibility. And I do mean that because that is really the point that we're going for ultimately. So kind of breaking those down, this is what I was talking about, that I will point out the parts on a visualization, including that source question. So all of the visualizations we're going to be looking at today are public domain or other Creative Commons opens license on Wikimedia Commons. All of those are words I love dearly, so I do want to say a quick thank you for all of those institutions at once. They make my life for this so much better, and I'm grateful they exist. So going down right into what I mean with this, an argument needs to be complete. I know I was saying earlier about all these parts it needs to have, but I want to show that I'm pretty serious about that, right? So, and also kudos to this. This is a COVID-19 vaccine doses administered March 4th, 2021 bar chart from Our World in Data, even though I found it via Wikimedia Commons. It was pretty difficult to actually find a visualization that already existed that had all the parts that I was looking for because it is not always that common. So kudos to them for this. It has the title, right? That's what I just told you, COVID-19 vaccine doses administered. It has the source. This is what I mean that so at the bottom it specifically says where we collected it, who's putting this together, right? It has the data. It's kind of everything in the middle, the content of the bars itself, of the bars in the bar chart, I mean. So then there's the structure, right? First, the decision that this is a bar chart at all, but also, it has axes, it has grid lines to help measure, and these vaccines are listed in millions, and so it has something to kind of help guide that if you're looking at it, perhaps where you can't see everything at once. It has labels, so this is both labels on the axes, right? So the countries on one axis, the million doses on the other axis. And it also summarizes, right, like what the amount of that bar is, right? So in the case of, what are we pointing at here? Germany, 7.1 million doses administered, right? But it says the 7.1 million. It's kind of the equivalent of annotations in my book. And the key in this case is built in because we do not have the labels of the countries separate from the color coding. But if we did for any reason, if they didn't fit, needing to map that like, oh, India has this kind of Kelly green on this list would be a necessity. And the significance, arguably the whole sample, right? Like that we're doing it for one day across countries. But I'd also argue it's ordered from most to least. That's a pretty default ordering in this case, but it still implies, right? We want to compare all of these. We want to look at what the most doses, right, versus the least. I am seeing another question in the chat, which I think is good timing because that's where I was with that. Let me see if I can open that successfully. I know how to use Zoom. I am really competent at using Zoom affirmations. Oh,
Anya just
okay.
said that she was
So,
dropping and might come back later.
perfect. Just making sure that I wasn't missing something important, right? And so, I hope that answered your question a little more clearly too about what I mean with the source versus the data. Like it is called out actually and kept next to the plot. Cool. So I really want to emphasize though how important it is for these things to be complete. It sounds really simple. It probably doesn't even sound like an accessibility concern to some people, but completely serious, it was the most consistent issue that we had in the user feedback sessions for disabled people trying to navigate visualizations, because kind of the process that happened with every participant actually and every plot that we encountered in these tests was they would first have to work to find a plot to successfully get into it, right? To be able to kind of interact with it at all, depending on what they had to do. But that was not as quick as a glance for most of them. That usually involved some kind of other digital gymnastics, I guess, is what I'll say, in order to be like, okay, I'm finally in the plot, I have the thing. And then they would realize that they couldn't actually answer my questions were often like, can you tell me what this is about? Or can you tell me like what you're looking at here, right? They couldn't because there wasn't a title on a bunch of these, right? They would say, oh, well, I see there's numbers, but they didn't put any units. I don't know what this is, right? Um, so it was really this anticlimax of having to work to get in here and then not even getting what the person was looking for in the first place. So really cannot stress enough, a complete is a very big step, as straightforward as it may seem, but I would love to see more visualizations with titles everywhere all the time, genuinely. Cool. Well, there's one soapbox put aside for me for the day. Now we'll get a little bit more specific. Right. Oh, actually, I'm wrong. We're not getting a little more specific yet. I've peppered in some questions to kind of check in on what visualization info would be relevant for people. So, what's the most information you've seen packed into a single visualization? I'll give you some time to answer in the chat if you wish by talking about one that I've seen and about how I often think, how would I adjust that? There was a project through, I believe it's the Stanford Digital Publishing Initiative. They have a whole bunch of projects on there. I used to do digital publishing work, that's why I'm aware of this. But it was like I prepared to explain this to you and I'm still not doing it right. It was a kind of a sea of data points, right? Like, and I truly mean it because they were all just lined up kind of loose with some kind of information, right? So in this some cases it was like the name of a director for a film. It was the, name of a specific event that happened in this country at the time. And it was interactive. It let people reading it map these things to another. So basically it allowed people to make these webs and see this connection. You could view the connections of other people. You could view additional data about each of these points. That one stands out in my mind forever as so deeply layered and so inherently visual that would be a challenge. I am seeing I should just keep the chat open. Probably Circo's plots in bioinformatics/genetics. That also seems like really, yeah, that's a density as well. Okay, so we've got some bio here. Thank you for including that. Awesome. I know there's so much variety. It's so exciting, but sometimes I'm also like, oh my gosh, how are we going to keep up? All right. My next recommendation, visualizations are ultimately a visual argument, right? It's in the name, but it's true. It's worth leaning into. Another common thing that I get from this is should I not use a visual aid at all, right? If they're always going to be exclusive because it's inherently visual. Anyone, blind or low vision is always going to have an issue because I'm catering to this sense. No, I think that it should still be done, right? There are many people who will still benefit from a visualization. There is not one kind of singular perfect accessibility answer anywhere anyway. So we are going for this plurality. Keep making things. It's just about making them better. So, oh, I left the right focus. Okay, there we go. So don't do that. If you're going to do a visual argument, right, what you really want to do in this case is to leverage those strengths, right? There are people who are really going to benefit from having a visualization, right? Whether that is someone just trying to interpret data, whether that is a cognitive disability, whether that is honestly, if someone is low vision, they may still benefit from seeing data this way. They just need to transform it for their needs. So, especially data about things that we are going to perceive visually, right? I have a visualization here that has map data, right? Like there's data for sea level on an actual map because this, while I'm sure it was collected with coordinates, seeing it as coordinates is not as helpful for seeing this trend of where seas are rising as it is to see it on a map, right? So this is inherently very visual data, really benefits from a visualization. Comparisons, patterns, and outliers, right? I think that's the main reason people go to visualizations, but lean into those then, make them really clear. Another reason that I like this sea level visualization is because it has this annotation, right? It's probably small on your screen, but it is describing like where this information is coming from, like what is this trend line that we're seeing, is really, really clear on this one, and you can see it on the map really quickly. And there's often room to annotate in a visualization where you won't just need to have a paragraph somewhere else. But in leveraging strengths, we also have to acknowledge the weaknesses. That's basically the rest of these slides, so we will be getting into this, but I don't want to discourage anyone from making visualizations. They definitely have a use, and there are many people that will benefit. Cool. Okay, I have another question for you. They are not after everyone, if that is any relief. I'm curious to hear, at what point do you decide to make a visualization for communicating with someone else, right? Once again, filling the initial airtime with me. With design choices all the time, I have to decide, is this better for me to type as a paragraph or to make something basically to point to different parts and show people? The answer for me is often both, but kind of the tipping point is, am I having to say over and over, like, this thing needs to behave this way? And if I find that repetition, sometimes it's easier just to say, okay, no, it should look and behave like this, like see it kind of in like a flip book animation, even almost, right? Of like, this happens, then this happens, is often a point for me because I'm so often working with things that are responding to inputs. That's when it kind of hits that point for me. A good visualization takes more time to create. So when there's time to create one, that's actually a really good answer. Yeah, that it's not just a default when you actually have time to make a visualization. Yeah, no, I really like that. I don't think anybody has said that one to me before, so I love that. Time being yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything that I want to say with that. Generally, I think that having the time is really good because then you're also, budgeting the time to kind of check for these things. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Moving on, if there is not more questions. So now I'm going to talk about arguments with the right different constraints. So in this case, an argument, right, or a visualization that is in grayscale. Color can be super helpful. The same way that I said earlier, that we still want to have visualizations. There's lots that a good color coding can do, right? Far be it from me to say color doesn't matter when I am wearing a yellow blazer today, right? The but the key thing is that the argument needs to be kept even if color information can't be seen, right? So This is an example curve plot that they left, right? Elevation versus distance on Media Commons. Whoop, no! I don't know why it's unhappy with me. Oh, of course it kicked it out. Wonderful technical difficulties. In another world, there is this plot, again, without the colors in it. I don't actually know what's happening because it did not do this earlier. Let me actually stop sharing for a moment and see if I can kick that. Sorry, because I think it's really helpful to see that. Are you unhappy with me, my friend? I don't know. Okay, no, I'm just going to share. The actual reload did not do it. Apologies for that. Pause. Okay. Well, we're back. We're going to show it anyway. Wonderful. Well,
On the other view, it actually showed the grayscale plot.
I know. Do you want to see that one? Are you okay seeing it not full screen?
I'm kind of curious.
Okay. Let's see. I think we have it mostly.
Okay.
Whoop, whoop, whoop. There's my crazy. Yeah. Okay. So smaller. I can make this a little bit bigger for you all with my so many things open all the time. So, oh, please stop clicking in there. One of the things that I really like switching from this one to this one, because the text, the grid lines, the axes were already in grayscale, they're preserved really well, right? I don't really have any issue looking at them from here. However, the data itself, it becomes very difficult now to follow the lines individually, right? Whereas here, the, difference between a neon green and a neon red may be more clear. They're basically the same value or like amount of light and dark when you have them in grayscale. However, it's a little bit hard to see because this was such a tiny plot, but I was happy to see it. The thing that they do well that I can't zoom in too well for you for is actually each of these lines has a letter associated with them so that you don't need to see the color. Even though maybe it stands out less, I can still see like, oh, this is the A line, whatever A is corresponding to, the key is not on this plot. So this is a great example for, they're using that color. It can work for people who can perceive the color or, like I have lots of things on my screen on grayscale when I'm not presenting, so I would lose it. But it uses labels, right? People often talk to about having like patterns for areas like in a bar chart or dashed lines, other shapes. That could work here too. I do really like the idea of a label because someone doesn't then have to be like, oh, well, this is a dashed line that's this size versus this. Using a contrast checker for colors you do see. I actually didn't link one here, which is an oversight on my part, but there are things that will say, this is really low contrast. So I mentioned here the parts that are, grayscale hold up really well because they already have that, while the rest flattens. That can be a great way to check that. When possible to avoid using that red and green to differentiate. I gave that example here. They're basically the same value when they become grayscale. That is the most common type of color blindness, right? That has come up. And in many cases, there's different meanings to red and green, different cultural contexts. So using those side by side is going to give you the most issues most frequently, even though there are other types of color blindness as well, and other just color like perception deficiencies. So yeah, I'm going to go back to full screen and see if this does it again, but I'm glad that we had it at all. That was my grayscale image for you. Are there questions with that? Okay, cool. So oh, please don't do that. Next, I'm wondering if it's going to break again. We'll see. I'm saying like an argument that scales. It doesn't just stay tiny. So, a common thing that I have accessibility, right, being concerns about blindness singularly and specifically, but visual acuity is not a binary, right? It's not usually see everything, see nothing. So you don't have to take off glasses if you wear them for this, but I did say when you see if you take off your glasses, hopefully it works no, it hates me on this one too. I think it hates all my edited images is what I'm getting, so I will stop screen sharing for that. I blurred this out to kind of show the difference between something that's crisp while still small on these slides and seeing what that could look like blurred. Now, this is a visualization for Wikipedia specifically. I'm going to move back. Oh, it's still kind of pale. For what they're labeling as toxic interactions or personal attacks on Wikipedia on a given month. I think it's a really cool visualization, right? In the sense that you can get kind of this big picture for a day. The globe is reflecting the globe that is Wikipedia's logo. There's some really good thought here. However, when I blur it out, one of the things I really like is I feel like I've switched to looking at some kind of biological like microbe. I feel like I've switched to a bioimaging project and I wouldn't even recognize maybe that this was in fact a visualization of this interaction data. I would think maybe this is microscopy data, right? That's been really cleaned up in some way. So I thought that was very funny when I encountered this one, and I think it's the kind of misinterpretation that I have seen in feedback sessions kind of recreated well. So you can't really get all of an argument unless you can actually perceive that argument, right? So in this case, needing to be able to perceive it if you're not seeing it as crystal clear, and even on these slides, you're seeing it much smaller and out of context, right, than the original visualization was made to be seen in. So some things that you can do to help things scale so that you don't have these perception problems. Make it responsive, right? So the same way that if I dragged my browser right now, we would see Google Slides change the size of my slide to respond to my window size. That's what I mean by responsive. And zoomable, meaning I can zoom in and out, right? Basically, right? Like zooming up to 4 times the size is a really good benchmark. And using no less than 14 pixel tall text on screens. I'm going to be honest, I would go a little larger, but this is kind of the standard expectation. Using the contrast checker again and can help you catch, in this case, this is also kind of a low contrast example where this text is blurred out. And limiting the colors you have available can be a great way to mitigate this too. Use them where it's relevant, but be thoughtful about which ones you use, because more colors is the same as having more dependencies to break in your library, right? You have more things that can interact with each other and become lower contrast really quickly. I'm laughing as I say this from experience. Your problems will multiply very quickly with more colors. So just being thoughtful about what you actually need, which is something that this visualization actually does very well, by the way. Grayscale in one color is pretty effective. And if you have an interactive visualization, you need to give generous target sizes. Depending on the way that you're creating it, you will get kind of different feedback, is why I don't give a specific one. But since you can see my cursor now here, giving more than kind of the cursor size is a really good place to start though, because it gives you some room basically to misclick, to kind of wiggle around, which is one of the issues. And the final, since I was talking about the switch from this like kind of looking, going from looking like a visualization referencing the Wikipedia logo to me thinking I'm looking at microscopy data, using familiar formats where possible. I don't want to tell people not to make creative visualizations. I actually think this one is pretty clever, but the fact is that when I show this, right, so this is another one, this is the images uploaded to Wikimedia Commons in a given year, classified, and it's the same text actually. And so this is a stacked bar chart, a much more standard visualization, right? That's a common plot. When I blur it out, even though I maybe can't read the numbers and the labels anymore, it still is a plot because it's a little more standard. So that's one benefit of working with things that are more familiar to people, or at least more standard to whatever space that you're doing visualizations in. Yeah, that was, yeah, I'm trying to think. I really set this part up a little weird, huh? But yeah, this, I don't have a good example of the scaling on here, but we will see one zoomed in a moment. Any questions with that as I break my slideshow again? Okay, awesome. So kind of related argument and what I'm going to call limited space. You're never going to know how much of a visualization can be seen at a single time. I understand the dismay that people often feel at this, right? Because they've crafted something that they think is really, effective, really creative. Uh, that's awesome, but you never really know how someone's going to perceive it when we're talking digitally. So this is a full one, right? Glider writing thermal from Wikimedia Commons without a title, right? But otherwise, we got some clear axes here. So when I mean limited space, I mean there's a good chance someone will be looking at it like this, where instead of seeing everything that is in, basically what is the data plotted, they might see a portion of the axes. They might see a portion of the data, because if they've zoomed in because they need it to see better, right? This is a very realistic view I saw often with user testing, right? There are kind of a few reasons that this might be encountered. So one is screen readers have become, I feel like, more common in conversations, which is awesome. But one I hear less about is actually a screen magnifier, which is basically the digital version of an analog magnifying glass, right, that you might use to look at paperwork with small text or books. There's a way you can magnify. So this was for anyone using a digital, right, like Zoom. Now I'm not, what am I saying? A screen magnifier. Yeah, for anyone using a screen magnifier, not Zoom, the app that we're working on right now. This was a really common thing to see, because they would be like, okay, I'm at 400 or more percent, so I'm seeing less than a quarter of this visualization that someone made at any given time, right? This can also happen just by, if you have a responsive thing, right? Zooming in the browser, having a different window, having a different screen size in the first place, right? There's only so much, right, you can do about this, because you never know exactly what someone's going to need. But dismay not, there are a few things you can do so that someone can tell that they are still working in a visualization, so someone can tell the information no matter how, what portion they're looking at. So one, scope what you're putting in that visualization thoughtfully. You want to keep it kind of cropped. Something that's good about this one is that there's not a lot of space on either side. That happened with some of our plots in testing, that people would leave good amounts of space, which as a designer, I can't really tell you not to do. But so they would just think there was nothing there, because they would be seeing a portion of the page that was just white space and a portion of the visualization, and they wouldn't even know to move over and see the plot is a very real risk. So keeping that in mind. Keeping the labels and annotations close to their related information. So one thing I really like about this one is that the labels are really close to their axes, right? Even when I'm zoomed in, I can kind of see them quickly. And having grid lines or other landmarks so that you can measure the data, even with the units out of sight. So I think I have one more. Yep. That was another thing that happened. So in this case, I can no longer see the y-axis if I want to see further along the x-axis a data point. And so I have no idea to know what right the y is anymore once I've moved like this, unless I remember. Whereas on the bottom right, it's for the z-axis, that those grid lines I can actually tell, even if I had moved over from this one and say, oh, this is 39.70. And I move over and say, okay, I followed this line from the back and see. So grid lines, while I know are often removed for clarity, they do serve a purpose in this case. Use that as you will. I often recommend something like this where keeping them, but maybe having them be understated. If you have something interactive, sometimes it's an option to have them on or off. But they do something more than put lines on your page, especially for people who are really zoomed in. Cool. Right. I do want to ask, this is our next question. Have you ever tried to open a data visualization on your phone or another small screen? This was another cool thing I often saw. in user testing, because people all have very different preferred devices. I got to see Jupyter notebooks on someone's cell phone. Jupyter notebooks were not made to be on someone's cell phone, I can tell you that. Um, have you ever tried to open one of these things on something it was clearly not suited for? Did anything interesting happen? Or was there anything you wish happened instead? Anything like that? For example, with the notebooks, I was surprised at some of the things that worked, like some of the, toolbars around it would still appear and scale appropriately, but because the plots were images, the way that that was handled could really vary, right? Like some of those plots became very tiny and didn't want to zoom in quite the same way as they did. But yeah. I'm opening the chat. I can do it. Yeah. I'm sure I have, but there isn't a specific memory. That's probably good, right? If it was really frustrating, you might remember how it went more. I would say we're in a better time sometimes for responsive things than we have been at other points in my digital life. So yeah. But this is a great way to, I brought this up as like a general question, but this can be a way to test, right? These things. Sometimes it's easier to see why Zoom might be necessary if you're working on a small screen, and so you can kind of get the impact of that easier. Cool. Right. So now I have an argument without visuals. You said it's a visualization. You're betraying us, Isabella. We're going to be doomed without the visuals because that's the whole point. Yeah, I understand why that would seem that way, but hooray! Text is to the rescue. We aren't doomed at all. There is a way to do this, right, without the visuals, even if it is initially a visualization or very visual data, as I was saying earlier, like map data or data with coordinates like that. Okay, so when I'm saying text, it's because, you know what, I'm going to back up actually, move this. Text is to the rescue because text is pretty incredible in terms of accessibility from I guess I'd say like from the assistive text standpoint, right? Text can be transformed, basically. It's very flexible, right? It can be translated from language to language with varying degrees of accuracy, right? But it can be in a way that I can't just immediately translate a image quite the same. It can be resized, right? I was just talking about scaling and zooming and responsive. Text does that really well. Text is usually pretty findable by assistive tech as well because it's kind of a standard. So screen readers often, they know how to handle text, right? We're going to see that like voice commands often know how to handle text because the text is what's required to navigate in the first place. So text is a really solid workhorse backup. I do want to applaud for text options. So the thing is though, depending how you make your visualization, the way that you may want to have this kind of text backup can really vary. And that's where it's a little, you're going to have to see based on your visualization, but I have a few options for you to consider. So whether you write it in, if it's an image, you might have access to alt text, right? Which is an HTML element specifically. This is kind of the standard that we want to have if alt text exists and you are using, like in the system you're using exists, and you are using an image, that is the right place to put an image description, right? You may, though, also want to include it in surrounding paragraphs if there are any. Something I say a lot when reviewing people's papers, blog posts, essays, is if I broke the link to your image, and sometimes if I have the ability to, I will break the link to their image and say like, oh, can we still get the argument, right? Like how much are you leaning on somebody being able to see this image? Because, right, it could just not load, right? My vision aside. So making sure, if there is a significance, say I was going with that, right? The first one I started with the COVID doses. If you want to say, oh, specifically this country had this many million doses on this day, and this was ranked whatever of whatever, that should probably be argued around it so that it's great to have that visualization and to have it for people who are kind of browsing through. but actually stating it elsewhere can also be a really useful option. Some of this information can fit in a caption. My hesitance here is captions often serve a purpose that is not only restating, right, what is in a visualization, but especially things like significance or sources or authors. Those things often fit in a caption. You don't have to do this all in one place, right? That could be really long image description, in fact, if you tried to. You could have an extended description linked from somewhere in the visualization. I see this often combined with one of these others, like that we have kind of a shorter, like, oh, this is a bar chart about this to this, and then an extended description describing all the data, right? That is an option. Uh, Depending too, I have had this a lot in this ecosystem. If the source for generating this visualization is right next to it, especially if there is something about it that has, I guess I'll say, an element of randomness. For example, I've worked with projects that have documentation in basically a hosted Jupyter notebook that every time they do it, it's going to run, right? There's a random number generator element to one of their tutorials. We can't know and describe exactly what it's going to output accurately because it's intentionally random. So one of the things that we did in that case was put a comment in the source code because you're running it, right? It is interactive documentation. Someone is able to access that source code. I would be wary of this just because it gets long, it can muddy things, but in many cases it is your best option. And I would also say something that happened a lot in our user feedback sessions was a lot of our participants who were code savvy would say, I don't even want to deal with the visualization. I'm going to work with the code, right, and the source data and find the answer to the question that you ask me for. That is not all of them, right? They do not all have that knowledge necessary to trawl through the data themselves, but this is an option too. So, because I listed several options there, I want to check, do people want any elaboration on any of these? Is there anything you think I missed in terms of like, oh, I'm working with this and it won't allow me to do such and such option? I do see images often, but not always. Oh, okay. I forgot I did this, but I also want to emphasize, I kind of said it in there, there's an and element, right? Like my personal recommendation is to have always some kind of surrounding text that it exists so you aren't relying solely on the visualization. I think that's the right way to do it and have it be an and with one of these other options instead of an or. But that's not always possible, right? There are not always surrounding paragraphs. I'm showing you that in these slides, right? That I'm showing you these visualizations out of their context. So, this is my next question for you. Do you know what kind of text options are available in the plotting software you or people you know use? This has been a common thing people have asked me, like, well, what should I use with this? And I'm like, what do you have? And nobody really knows, and we have to go dig up the documentation. Or sometimes people will say, I've been trying to add alt text to this plot I generated in this library, and I'll go look on the documentation and realize that's not supported at all. Of course you can't find it, right? It isn't in the library. Is this something that people are aware of? Is this a big question mark? Do you know that you don't have text options built in? Hmm, going ahead of myself there.
Don't really do a lot of plotting, so
Yeah. It's perfectly fine. It can be a rhetorical question too of double checking for sure, because I often have to dig things up when I enter a new project and we're working with some kind of new software. Yeah. Awesome.
but but the last slide had me intrigued a little bit because I suppose like sometimes if I if the image that I have, so say I have a document and like I have an image in that document, if it is adequately described in the surrounding paragraphs, don't usually bother to put alternative text. And I was curious if there's a counter argument there.
I'm taking a deep breath because I'm thinking in my head what is the useful since I'm trying to keep this so that people don't have to have too much accessibility knowledge. It's a very good question though, and this is a
Mm.
oft
Mm,
debated in accessibility circles that I've seen is where I'm
mm,
trying to go with this. People have some different arguments, if you will, to follow the theme
mm,
about what should be done in these cases. I think in keeping it simple with this, the ultimate goal, right, that I'm trying to get across here is what we're trying to do with accessibility, like for visualizations in practice, is to prevent as much loss of information as we can, right, in these different situations. And so if that is the goal, I think there's a lot of different ways to meet it, not to not answer your question, but right, like if it really is everywhere else, like if I really break your image link and there's no alt text and I'm not missing any info, I don't think that that's the worst thing. The main thing I would say is if someone is going to do that intentionally, which to be clear, I have seen on many things, there is some very known and big tech company, I do not want to name, documentation that actually uses that exact policy, right? Where they're like, we're describing everything somewhere else. We don't want someone to have to hear it twice, essentially, that you hear it in the paragraph and then in the image description and over, right? Like, that's also not a good use of people's time. Then you do want to mark that image probably as it would be considered decorative. And so it's usually worth making sure that the alt text field exists but is empty if you have that power, right? Because having it exist but have right no string within it means that assistive tech knows to skip it is the main thing. And so it's kind of the same sentiment you have where you're like, I already told you this information, I'm not going to tell you again. If it does not have alt text, then the assistive tech will try and say, well, there's an image here, but I don't have anything for you besides the file name, most likely, but sometimes other. So I don't think that that is a approach that is bad, and I think it can create an equivalent experience really easily, but that's the main risk that you have. And I would also say if you decide to include it, like include in paragraphs and in alt text, in terms of repetition, if someone thinks they're hearing repeated information, they can skip it, right? That is an option. Someone is not just locked in to hearing everything that you put on a page. They may be locked into like a segment. For example, I don't think they can fast forward through alt text to see if they got to the end and you have different info, but they can say, I've already heard all this, I'm skipping it. Did that answer your question? Hopefully not too
that,
long-winded.
that that makes sense. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a good question, but for sure to summarize, like the end experience is what I would make that judgment based on if you have the ability to kind of see what happens when you have it with or without. Cool. I asked that already. Wonderful. So we're going to go kind of into the multimedia thing at the end here. We're almost kind of at the end of peeling back these different layers of visualization, but I think it's worth noting because I see a lot of interactive visualizations in this space. So if you have a visualization that has a sound component, and we're going to actually argue that then without the sound component, really the same kind of method as the color that we discussed earlier holds true. You just need to have an additional form, right? There's not a big thing that says you can or can't do sound. And so in this case, kind of like I was just talking with the alt text, actually, thank you for asking that. Considering what information the sound adds is going to be kind of key to figuring out what you need to do instead, right? If it's ambient sound, it may be decorative the same way we were talking with that image, essentially, right? Where this is not any loss of information. we do still want to try and preserve experience because that is, I would say, right, like ethical thing, like disabled people deserve to have, as much of the same experience as abled people that we can create, but also not wanting to clog that up, right? You might decide like, I don't know, this is a chimpanzee habitat suitability map, and you decide, okay, well, in the original, there's just chimpanzee noises all over it all the time. Um, you may say, that doesn't really tell me anything. I don't even know if that's a mood setter in this case. Why do I have that here, right? And you may decide you don't want it. If it's informational though, then that's something, right, we do want to try and capture. And this could be like, you have it visually. It has some kind of pop-up thing. If it signals an interaction, right? So like say it's a part of a hover state, for example, that you know that this is interactive because it makes a little chime at you, then you definitely need to make sure that that has some kind of other component. Usually, right, a text option is going to be pretty workhorse, but like people do visual often too. I'm trying to think what I'm saying. Oh, since this reminded me when I gave the constant chimpanzee hooting sounds, which to be clear is not part of this visualization as far as I know. That one is hypothetical. These people did not do that. If you are going to have sound that plays automatically, which is not ideal, right? I think we've all lived through the era of MySpace pages where you go on a page and you're listening to someone's playlist endlessly. Not super fun. And if it can't be paused or anything, that's not really good. There should be a way to shut off the sound on anything that you're doing. Yeah, cool. So that's sound. Now I want to say without a mouse, right? Because we are talking typically about digital visualizations in this case. For anyone who doesn't know, if you don't have a mouse, right, how do you move around your computer? The next most likely is going to be a keyboard. But wait, you say, this keyboard, it doesn't have the same thing. Like with my mouse, I can move anywhere at any time. That's true. You can't. It's a much different interaction. So to kind of give some context, you're going to navigate right by pressing those keys. In many cases, you do big jumps with your tab key, actually, and there is more fine-tuned movement, but I will not be teaching you the intricacies of keyboard navigation today. Hover states, though, don't exist, really. So don't rely on that for information because you never really know how someone's interacting with it. This is actually true of touchscreens too. If you've ever kind of switched between those modes, I was saying open your visualization on a phone earlier. You won't have hover states anymore if you do that. Focus states are basically kind of like the placeholder, like the "you are here" on your computer, which should be everywhere, but are not always. So I can discuss these more, look them up if there are questions. They become vital because otherwise you don't know where you are, right? Like imagine that giant map of something and you don't have the "you are here" symbol. How do you orient yourself if you've never been to this place before? And visualizations you want to guide people through like in what you would expect the reading order to be if people are going to go, more linearly than you could with a mouse when they're working with a keyboard. Just by nature of the keyboard kind of requires that next, 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 where with a mouse you can move anywhere. So whatever you consider reading order for your visualization, and I would generally call that the general info to specific. So starting with like, this is a plot titled this. We're looking, right? Like, so in this case, this is chimpanzee habitat suitability. This is, a map. I might even say heat map if I know my audience is going to know what that is. Describing, like where is highly suitable or well, low suitability to high suitability in Africa. These are kind of regions that have high suitability if I'm talking about high, or if I'm talking about like, just surrounding context. There's not very much of it, right? It kind of depends on what you're doing there. Cool. And oh no, I already took away your sound and your mouse, and now I'm going to take away your keyboard. What are you going to do, right? Like these constraints. Without a keyboard, what's going to happen next? It's the most common answers are that somebody's going to have another key or button arrangement. That's not a keyboard, right? It may be more of a binary kind of yes, no. There's a bunch of options there. Could have a mouse stick or some other kind of like joystick that doesn't require the same fine motion. Someone could also use voice control, right? They could say, you know, I've been watching a lot of Star Trek, so it's on my mind, computer, do this. That's not quite how voice control works, but it's close enough if you have the context. You know, computer, read me the chimpanzee habitat suitability plot. That could be a thing. In this case, the thing that I really want to get across, because there's so much variety here, is that these options mostly all map to the same behavior as keyboard controls. That's kind of the baseline one if you want to test anything, is working with that keyboard, that you can make other button arrangements work, or, you know, voice control, because they can say, you know, I want to hit this thing on my keyboard, and basically use keyboard controls vocally is not uncommon even. So keeping that as the baseline is a really good thing. Keyboard navigation is a great way to test your stuff. I think we have hit, okay. Those are kind of basic multimedia interactive data visualization interactions I see, right? Like people add sound, people want it to have, you know, interactions and hover states, and people to be able to move through the layers. Those are the most common I see, but I want to check, are there, you know, multimedia things, interactive things you wish I covered? Are there any you do often or that you wish you knew how to handle? Because I'm happy to take a moment to discuss those. I believe I am still good on time, though someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I think something that comes to my mind, even if you don't have questions, is I didn't talk about like video-y things or time lapses. You know, what do you do with that? Kind of the same with sound, wanting to be able to stop and start things, be able to navigate within it. But yeah, if you don't have any more though, that's fine. I'm hoping I'm catching popular ones anyway. I That's my wrap up in terms of peeling things back. So if you have any other specific questions with that, I can answer them later, but just keep it on your mind. You made it through my pulling apart everybody's data visualizations. Congratulations. I'm just going to do kind of some wrap up here to be ready. So I think the, you know, key thing, if I could have, I'm going to say two takeaways, because the first takeaway I really want is that make your visualizations complete. That would make a really big difference. I've seen what a difference it can make. But my second thing is represent information multiple ways, right? Celebrate backups and redundancies, having that, you know, text backup, saying, okay, well, I'm color coding it, but not saying like, oh, well, it's a waste then for me to also have it like have kind of a shape encoded next to it, right? For example, instead of it being green and red, it could be a green check mark and a red X. That way, even if someone can't see red and green, or they maybe think of it in a different way, they can still recognize it maybe with the check and X, regardless of the color. That kind of stuff is really the best way to catch all these different things, right? Like people are people and infinitely, you know, varied in their abilities. Giving them infinite ways to engage as much as you can. I say infinite, giving them many ways to engage is more what I mean, is often the answer to making sure that people can actually get all the information you give and get the argument you're trying to get across with your visualization. And when in doubt, for those of you who were at my previous event 2 weeks ago, this is the same slide, but it still holds true with data visualization. Making the time to do things right. That's why I was so happy earlier when I said, when do you decide to make a visualization? And it was when I have time. That's a great answer, right? You do want to do it right. Rushing is not going to help you with any accessibility thing any more than it's going to help you with making a general visualization. It's so true. Thinking before you act, a lot of what I told you today was, this is the desired outcome, and this is the outcome that I have seen in practice with people. Thinking about what could be the consequences and impact is often the best right thing to do, to think like, well, what do I want to happen? What would be the pleasant thing? And figuring out how to do that, especially today, since I can't tell you, with a single plotting library, this is how you do this, because I don't know what library you're using or other software. Um, that's kind of the way to start moving forward with it, and to start looking for answers to those questions if they aren't as, obvious to you in that first moment. And still be cautious of over optimizing. I mentioned this last time with image descriptions, and I'm going to say it again because it holds true here. I often see people get really enthusiastic about trying to make things more accessible, and that's great. But in that situation, they're like, I need to describe every pixel about this image. And by that, I mean, they'll be like the texture of this, or which is usually not relevant to the main reason. Part of the reason that I brought up arguments and kind of used this as the framing for the visualization is because that's the kind of information that we do want to optimize for. Describing the styling of the visualization, like if it's in cursive writing and it's not a visualization that is about, the ability of people in this country to write in cursive from this year to this year, it's probably not relevant. Even in that case, it may not be relevant, right? That it's designed that way. So really thinking about, what am I trying to communicate? What do I really need to make sure is here? And what do I need to say to not, also waste people's time? Because there's a good chance they already spent longer trying to get into your visualization in the first place. Yeah. So same when in doubts, but still true. They are ones that I definitely try to hold to for myself. So, and further resources, this is a little tricky because even though I gave all those external recommendations earlier, I didn't just want to give them again. The World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative, or W3CY, when they don't have me saying so many words, I don't get paid words per minute. Maybe I should, right? But this has a whole bunch of tutorials. I keep pointing to them because they have a lot. I am not aware of them having a singular data visualization section, to be clear. I could be wrong about that. When I last looked, that was not the case. However, they have lots of tutorials for more specific interactions. So if you say, hey, I don't really know how to handle, a checkbox, because I have filters where you can turn on and off, like the different states of this visualization. They have a tutorial on checkboxes, I'm pretty sure, right? I'm saying that now, if someone's going to fact check me and I'm going to be wrong. But point being, they have tutorials on a level that may be helpful as you're trying to figure out more specifics. And check out the documentation of any plotting software you use. It depends, but some of them do have information about what support they provide. And any organizations that your visualization is related to, right? For example, a lot of educational institutions have some kind of policy on this stuff. If you're making something in the context of an educational institution, making sure that you're following their guidelines is usually good practice, and may actually get you help too from whatever your relevant resource center is. A lot of people have some kind of disability resource center at universities, at least, that may have more expertise for you. Yeah, this one is a little trickier though, other than those resources, which I don't think I linked again. Maybe I did. I thought I did. But regardless, they are in the notes, all the other recommendations that exist for you to work with. And upcoming events, because that is what I do. Gasp! It's perfect for halfway through the month of October when we have Halloween coming up. You do a little scream because there are no upcoming events planned. This is, though, a big shout out. If anyone is interested in running this event and running similar accessibility events, because I've done several of them, you can reach out and ask. I often organize them across communities. I have done others for Scientific Python. We've done the alt text before here, and for many other projects. And I mean many, I have a list. So if there's any interest or a problem that I haven't discussed that you're interested in, let us know. And I may be able to work something out for you. It's really cool to see people caring about accessibility. So thank you so much for your time. I think we have I do always my questions and contact slide, so I will be quiet actually and stop recording so that we can have questions without you having to record yourself more than you have. Thank you so much though, and have a good day for anyone listening to the recording.